As all of you know, according to the Bible, human beings were created in the image of God. But how is this enigmatic phrase in Hebrew, Tselem Elohim, or image of God, to be understood? What does it mean to say that human beings have been created in the image of God? And how does the claim that human beings have been created in the image of God relate to the problem of the meaning of life? I would like to begin to try to answer these questions by looking at a number of interpretations of this biblical phrase, the image of God, that appear in classical Jewish religious literature. First, we have the view of the Talmudic rabbis that the term image and likeness of God means that we should practice what in Latin is called imitatio Dei, meaning imitating the benevolent deeds of God. As the Talmud puts it, just as God clothes the naked, attends the sick, and comforts the mourner, so should we do likewise. Just as God performs acts of loving kindness, justice, and compassion, so should we do likewise. In this view, meaning comes from living in a way that is compatible with our having been created in the image of God. It means manifesting through action, through deeds, the image of God that has been implanted within each of us. That human meaning relates to the performance of such sacred and significant deeds was a theme I discussed, as some of you may remember, in the first presentation in this series. Second, we have the view, discussed at some length by the great 16th century Jewish mystic, Rabbi Dr. of Prague, known in Hebrew as Maharal. Maharal interprets the phrase image of God to relate to what he considers the attribute that we human beings share with God, an attribute which in his view also differentiates the human being from angels on the one side and from animals on the other side, and that attribute is freedom of choice. Let me read one paragraph from Rabbi Lowe's commentary to the Ethics of the Fathers, the Pirkei Avot. I quote, "In this way, human beings resemble God in that they were created in the divine image. But this is not the case with angels, who have no choice. They, namely angels, only do what God appoints them to do, and they are incapable of altering their mission. But human beings, who were created in God's image, enjoy the benefit of making choices and determinations for themselves like God does, because God does what he desires. And thus, human beings control their own selves to do what they will and are masters of their ability to choose." End of quote. And so, according to this view of Rabbi Lowe, the term image of God refers to freedom of choice, particularly freedom of moral choice. Without choice, there's only determinism. If we cannot assume that choice exists, we cannot posit responsibility for human behavior. In other words, without freedom of choice, the individual is stifled from enacting and from articulating the meaning of his or her own life. Making our lives meaningful, therefore, presumes freedom of choice and the freedom of action to imbue our lives with meaning, purpose, and significance, to express through a lifestyle our having been created in the image of God. Now, to the point in the biblical text, in Genesis, where God is described as creating human beings in the image and likeness of God, all we've been told about God to that point is one thing, and that is that God is a creative being. Therefore, one may interpret the phrase image of God to mean that human beings, like God, have the capacity for creativity. And certainly without freedom of choice, already discussed, there can be no creativity, because free will and creativity go hand in hand. In this regard, let's reflect for a moment on a biblical verse in the first book of Samuel, chapter 2, verse 2, that reads as follows. Here is the verse. "There is none as holy as the Lord, For there is none beside you, God, neither is there any rock like our God. What do we learn from this verse? First, we learn that God is unique. There is none like God. Similarly, each human being is unique. Our uniqueness is part of our having been created in the image of God. In other words, the challenge to each of us is to articulate our individual uniqueness in the life that each of us chooses to lead. And I'll come back to this in a moment, but in the meantime, let's look at how the Talmud interprets one phrase in this verse, the phrase that says, "Neither is there any rock like our God." Now, the Hebrew word for rock used there is tsur, which the rabbis suggested, because it sounds like it, could also be read as tsayar. Tsur, tsayar. Tsayar means an artist. This would translate the verse as, instead of "there is no rock like our God," it would translate as "there is no artist like our God." In other words, God is a creative artist. And our having been created in the image of God means that we, like God, can become creative artists. But what is the work of art that each of us is commissioned to create during our lives? The answer is, it is each of our lives. In other words, each of us in this view is a creative artist with a mission to create one great work of art during our lives, and that great work of art is our life. This is the way in which we articulate our freedom, our creativity, and our having been created in the image of God. Therefore, I'd like to suggest that for Judaism, life is the highest art form. Creating one's life as a work of art is for Judaism the meaning of human existence. In this view, the challenge posed to each of us is creating each of our lives as a work of art. At birth, each of us is issued a passport to transcendence. Each of us is offered an invitation to become more than we are. And at life's end, we are asked to justify how we have developed the raw materials, the talents and abilities granted to us at birth. In the art of life, each of us is responsible for creating the greatest work of art that we can, and that's the way we elicit meaning from life. Now, if life is compared to a great work of art, we must now move to the question of which ingredients are required to produce a great work of art. Which ingredients are needed to create one's life as a great work of art? The first ingredient is hard and constant work at it. Great art is not the product of fleeting inspiration. For as Thomas Alva Edison put it, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Similarly, the creation of life as a work of art requires constant effort. And in this regard, Rabbi Israel of Salant compared the moral and spiritual development of a person to the flight of a bird. Because once a bird stops exerting effort to fly, once a bird ceases flapping its wings, it falls. Similarly, building one's life as a work of art requires constant exertion, study, reflection, and practice. According to Maimonides, the quest for human meaning, for creating life as an art form, cannot be acquired by proxy. Nobody else can do it for us. And this is how Maimonides interpreted the well-known Talmudic adage, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" He interpreted it to mean that no one but oneself can create the work of art that can become one's own self. No one can do it for us. The second ingredient is study of past masterpieces. An apprentice artist must study the works and techniques of the great masters before trying to compose a great work of his or her own. And similarly, we have to turn to the great spiritual maestros of the past to study the techniques they developed in the art of living. We stand in awe of the masterpieces which are each of their lives. Each aspiring artist studies the works of those great artists who came before. It was the great philosopher Spinoza who said, "If you want the future to be different than the past, then study the past." So to disregard the spiritual resources that we have inherited from the past is to squander a much needed and a much readily accessible heritage. To relinquish hard-won cumulative wisdom and experience, and to expect our souls to develop spontaneously and simply on their own, is in my view a misguided hubris. The quest for meaning may be facilitated by tapping into the substantial resources bequeathed to us by past tradition and past spiritual experience. And therefore it only makes sense that we ought to consult those past wisdom figures who best represent the art of soul crafting, those cartographers of the human soul, those physicians of the human spirit. For in creating life as a work of art, no one is a self-made man. It was the great American statesman Henry Clay in the 1850s who coined this term, self-made man. And when Mark Twain heard it, he said, "A self-made man is about as likely as a self-laid egg." We would never buy a house or a car or deal with matters of our health without expert advice, without consulting those with knowledge and experience. But yet, we often take our most valuable possessions, our own souls, and we allow them to develop without consultation with the wisdom of the past. It is our spiritual dimension that ensures our uniqueness, that ensures that which makes each of us who we are, and each of us who we can become. There has never been another human being like you, like your beloved, like your child. You may believe that uniqueness is limited to your fingerprints or your DNA, but if you believe that there is more, if you believe that there is an ineffable, sublime essence to being human, if you believe that there is a quiet eminence to your own unique mode of being, then how will you honor it? How will you nurture it? How will you develop? Souls can grow, and the aim of life, the purpose of life, is to end it with a soul more beautiful than when we began. The aim of life is to create one's life, to craft one's soul into the most beautiful work of art that we can. Historically, little Jewish genius was invested throughout the ages to create great works of fine art. But much Jewish genius and effort was expended on the endeavor to create lives that were works of art. Rather than concentrating on things of beauty, Jewish teachings focused on the creation of people of beauty, lives of beauty. The goal was to become a shener mensch, a shener yid, a beautiful person, a beautiful Jew. The third ingredient in creating one's life as a work of art is imagination. We need to transcend ourselves in order to envision who we can yet become. For without imagination, without vision, an artist has nothing to express, nothing to convey. And neither the life of art nor the art of life can move to a higher plane without imagination, without visions, and without dreams. In an episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, a strange malady inexplicably affects the members of the crew. People become anxious and irritable. Some go insane. Then they start to die. The medical staff runs tests, but without results. The cause of the strange illness cannot be identified by any means of medical diagnostic technology. But in discussing the situation, the crew members discover that they all have something in common, something that they initially had overlooked, something that might be the cause of the affliction. And what they find out is that for some reason they had stopped dreaming. And then a drug is prepared that introduces dreams into the sleep cycle, and as a result, people begin to dream again, and the crisis passes. The moral of the story is that people cannot live without dreams. The same lesson is taught by the biblical prophets who said, without vision, the people perish. And by Shakespeare who said, we are such stuff as dreams are made. Or as Thoreau said, I learned at least this by my experiments, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life that he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. He will put something behind and will pass an invisible boundary. So like any other creative endeavor, creating life as a work of art requires dreams, visions, fantasies, and imagination. And in this regard, the Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, interpreted the verse we're discussing, image of God, to mean that the human being, like God, is a being with an imagination. Image relates to imagination. That we, like God, are a being who fantasizes, who imagines, who dreams, and therefore, because we dream, fantasize, and imagine, are beings who can create. The image of God for Nachman is the ability to fantasize, to imagine, and to dream. And so the creation of life as a work of art begins with a vision, with a dream of who we want to be, of what kind of person we want to become. And the next task after that is bringing about a transition from where and who we are now to where we want to be and who we want to become. And so creating life as a work of art is an answer to the questions, what kind of person do I want to become? It's an answer to the question, how can I imbue my life with meaning? Now, in the 13th century, we find the great Jewish mystic Abraham Abulafia. In his writings, and in the writings of the first Jewish mystic in Eastern Europe, Rabbi Moses of Kiev, there is the view that what the mystic aspires for in the mystical experience is not only communion with God, or devekut in Hebrew that I discussed last week, but is also the goal of seeing a vision of one's own self with all of one's potentialities and all of one's possibilities fully developed. In other words, in this vision, one sees a version of the best work of art that one could possibly make out of one's own life. And then the challenge becomes to move from where we are to where we can yet go, from where we are toward that vision of the best that we can ever become. A fourth ingredient in creating one's life as a work of art is careful use of our skills. One wrong stroke of an artist can ruin a painting. One wrong note of a composer can ruin a symphony. One wrong act can mar a life. And in this regard, a Hasidic master, Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, once said that everybody should consider his or her own self as if we were tightrope walkers, walking over a tightrope, and below is an abyss. And each of us is wearing a white garment, and on our head is a bottle of ink. One small wrong step, and the ink soils the white garment. but one big wrong step, and we fall into the abyss below. Great works of art are original. They are unique. And the goal of each human life is for each person to create his or her own life as a unique work of art. Creating life as a work of art is a way of forging and articulating our own potentiality for individuality and for uniqueness. But the tragedy of many lives, according to the great 18th century British poet Edward Young, is that people tend to be born as originals, but to die as copies. Creating life as a work of art is a way of affirming that we want to be originals and not copies. And in this regard, there is the very well-known Hasidic story about the Hasidic master, Rabbi Zusya of Hanapol. It had been told that when the great Hasidic master, Rabbi Zusya of Hanapol, was on his deathbed, he began to cry. And his disciples asked, "Master, why do you cry? Do you cry because you're afraid that when you arrive before the heavenly tribunal, they will ask you, why were you not like Isaiah? Or why were you not like Maimonides?" And Zusya said, "No, I'm not worried that they will ask me why I wasn't like Isaiah, because I wasn't a prophet like Isaiah. And I'm not worried that they will ask me, why weren't you like Maimonides, because I was not a great philosopher like Maimonides. Then why are you crying, Master?" the disciples asked again. "Because," he said, "I am afraid that they will ask me, Zusya, why were you not like Zusya? Why weren't you your own self? Why weren't you all that you could be? And if they ask me that, what can I answer?" A fifth component in artful existence is the need to make choices, judgments, commitments, the decision to decide. The philosopher Kierkegaard translated Socrates' admonition, "Know yourself." Kierkegaard translated it as "choose yourself," because in a real way, an individual is the sum of all the choices we make over a lifetime. But not making choices, refusing to make choices, only leads to anxiety, helplessness, and spiritual paralysis. For as the great British philosopher and Nobel Prize winner Bertrand Russell put it, nothing is so exhausting as indecision, and nothing is so futile. And in this regard, consider the old story of Buridan's donkey. It's told that the medieval philosopher Buridan had a donkey who, like his master, was also a philosopher. One day, rather than offering the donkey his morning bale of hay, Buridan offered the donkey 2 equal bales of hay. And the donkey, being a philosopher, spent the entire day trying rationally to decide which bale of hay to eat. But the donkey could not decide which bale of hay was better than the other, since they were equal. This went on day after day, until the poor donkey, unable to decide, starved to death. So in a way, human existence is a game of you bet your life. We must take the risk of making choices, even though it might be the wrong choice. Nevertheless, one must make the leap of commitment before starving to death while viewing the repast of options set out before us. A sixth ingredient in crafting the soul entails the focusing of one's thoughts, choices, commitments, and actions on what matters most, on what is most meaningful. And this requires 2 things. It requires first the thoughtful choice of a task, a goal, a project, which is replete with meaning. And secondly, it requires the discipline the personal discipline to focus on that task. Crafting the soul entails the enactment of an action plan to articulate in deeds those ideas, commitments, and values that matter most. But focusing on a goal requires that there be a goal upon which to focus. Accomplishing meaningful goals is a crucial component in enacting life's meaning. Goals provide us with something to live for, a project, a profession, a calling, a family, and the body and soul respond to that with vitality. The goal-oriented person wakes up each day ready to devote himself or herself to the task at hand. As the old proverb puts it, the purpose of life is a life of purpose. The purpose of life is a life of purpose. Or, as George Bernard Shaw once said, each person has a choice in life. And that choice is between a life of purpose on the one hand, or life, in his words, as a feverish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. So human beings apparently need purposeful activity, structured activity, to feel purposeful and meaningful, and to prevent themselves from becoming bored. For as the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm once pointed out, the human being is the only animal that can choose to be bored. Creative and self-fulfilled people are rarely either bored or boring. But on the other hand, the boring or bored person often harbors a sense of meaninglessness, a lack of purpose and direction, a spiritual emptiness, manifesting itself as listlessness and as depression. Boredom is often coupled with loneliness. Yet creative people, while often alone, are rarely lonely. Indeed, the creative person finds being alone for long stretches of time as a desirable state. And in many spiritual traditions, what we might consider the horror of loneliness is viewed by those traditions rather as the opportunity for solitude, because creativity is what an artist does with his or her solitude. However, on the other hand, for the spiritually impoverished person, for the non-creative person, solitude is something to be dreaded, not to be welcomed, because it's a gateway to boredom. It's an entree to emptiness. And with nothing to do, the mind is unable to prevent negative thoughts from moving on to center stage. The dread of being alone can lead to obsessive and sometimes dangerous practices, such as regular use of alcohol or drugs, frivolous sexual liaisons, compulsive shopping, non-stop TV viewing, whatever it is that dulls or distracts the mind. Yet a person with control over his or her own consciousness, a person with a focal point of creative attention, can turn the dread of loneliness into the opportunity for creative solitude. Indeed, the greatest, and also some of the not so great, works of art, literature, music, have been created precisely in solitude. Some people fill the void of their loneliness by fabricating things to worry about as a substitute for confronting their own inner emptiness. Rather than concentrating upon what matters, rather than confronting the self, such individuals often become obsessed with worrying about the unlikely catastrophes that they feel certain will befall themselves or those whom they care about. And in my view, these people exemplify the old Jewish joke, which goes like this: what is a Jewish telegram? It's a telegram that reads, "Start worrying now, letter to follow." Now, a final ingredient in creating life as a work of art is the cultivation of the moral values, of the moral virtues. What we value is that which matters most to us, that which elicits meaning from life. And how we cultivate the moral virtues relates most directly to what kind of person we want to be and how to become that person. But virtues are not absolutes. Rather, the moral virtues are pathways, they're guides, they're indicators, they're traffic signals. They point the way and they offer direction toward a life of meaning and purpose, toward the spiritual augmentation of the self, toward the creation of life as an art form. As the great German philosopher Nietzsche wrote, no people can live without valuing. Valuing is creating. Without valuation, the nut of existence is hollow. And virtues are also important, and we see this especially today, because virtues serve as a cement for a society. And without virtues, the stability of a nation can become imperiled. For example, as President James Madison wrote, to suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. Or as Lewis Mumford said, the chief purpose of human existence is the creation and the preservation of values. That's what gives meaning to our civilization. And the participation in this is what gives significance ultimately to each individual life. And so the pursuit of virtue relates most directly to what kind of human being one wants to become and how one wants to become that person. The moral virtues, some of which I discussed in the last 2 weeks, such as love, humility, gratitude, wisdom, and friendship, are key ingredients to creating one's life as a work of art. And now I move to summarize the points made in all the 3 sessions, including today. We have been looking at how classical Jewish sources view the meaning of life. And I've suggested to you that if you survey the whole history of Judaism, you find 6 major responses have been offered to the question of the meaning of life, and these 6 are: number 1, meaning derives from faith in God, because God is the source of all meaning. 2, meaning comes from the performance of deeds that are sacred and significant. 3, meaning comes from the perpetuation of that which outlasts us and of that which transcends us. And I related that in the first presentation to the idea of the afterlife. 4thly, which I discussed last week, meaning comes from committed, loving relationships. And 5thly, meaning comes from living in partnership with God. And then 6thly, which I discussed today, meaning comes from living in the image of God, namely from fulfilling the mission of each human life. And what is that mission? The mission is to create each of our lives as the most beautiful work of art that we can during our lives. And finally, where and whence can one begin to elicit meaning from life? How do we begin this process? And the answer, I think, is best put in a story. And here's the story. Once there lived in Krakow a rabbi named Rabbi Isaac, and he was very poor. Rabbi Isaac lived with his wife and children in a house with only 1 room. And in the middle of the room, there was a stove. During the winter, when they had money for wood, the heat of the stove would offer warmth and would cook the meager food that barely sustained them from day to day. But then one night, the rabbi had a dream. He dreamed that in a land called Bohemia, in a city called Prague, there was a bridge under which a river flowed. The bridge was near a large castle, and under the bridge, on the bank of the river, an enormous treasure was buried. When the rabbi awoke the next morning, he remembered his dream in vivid detail, but the needs of his congregants were pressing, and off he went to the synagogue. Yet all through that day, all he could think about was this dream. That night he went to sleep hoping that in his sleep he might be free of the dream from the previous night, but once again the dream returned, and it was absolutely identical to the dream he had had the night before. In the morning he awoke, and the dream once again preoccupied him throughout the day. But when the same dream came again that third night, he knew it was not simply a dream, but it was a message, for so tradition teaches. He awoke, he looked at his exhausted wife, his hungry children shivering in their sleep near the cold stove. He dressed quietly, and he left a note that he had gone to Prague to see his dream. The rabbi traveled through the cold and dangerous roads from Krakow to Prague for 3 days and 3 nights, and on the morning of the 4th day he entered Prague. It was not long before he saw the river, and the river was exactly the way it was in his dream. He followed the river until he came to a bridge near a huge castle, and both were so identical to what he had seen in his dream that he thought that he was still in his bed in Krakow, asleep and dreaming. He looked down from the bridge at the spot where the treasure was supposed to be buried, but because the nearby castle was the castle of the king, royal guards stood watch on the bridge all day. And so the rabbi waited all day for the guards to leave so that he could dig up the treasure under the bridge. But when the sun had set and the guards had left, a new group of guards came immediately to replace them, and so day after day, night after night, the rabbi stayed near the bridge, hoping for an hour when the bridge would be unguarded and he could dig up his treasure. Now, as time passed, the rabbi became friendly with one of the guards who stood post on the bridge. The guard was grateful to have a person of culture and learning with whom to converse during the long, lonely hours of standing guard on the bridge. And so one day, the guard told the rabbi, he said, "You know, I had a strange dream last night. I dreamed that in a land called Poland, in a city called Krakow, there lives a pious but poor man with a wife and many children, and they live in a one-roomed house, and in the middle of the room there is a stove, often cold because they have no money for wood, and under that stove there is a great treasure buried." Rabbi Isaac immediately, after hearing that, returned home. He came into the house, he moved the heavy stove, and he began to dig beneath it. And there, in a large iron trunk, he found a great treasure. And with half of the money from that treasure, he built a great synagogue, and that synagogue still stands in Krakow today and is called Rabbi Isaac's Synagogue. What is the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that the treasure we seek, often unbeknownst to us, is right beneath our feet, and all we need to do is to dig for it. In other words, the place to begin is within our own selves, within our own souls, because spiritual development is an inside job. The path toward meaning begins with the inward journey, and it is a journey that each of us is obliged to take to fulfill the mission of creating each of our lives as a work of art. This is how we find human meaning. This is the journey we must all go on. And my wish for each of us, for all of us, is that we should do well on that journey. Thank you.